He divorced me for a fresh start, but he didn't realize the wife he threw away was the only thing keeping his empire from collapsing into federal evidence. The champagne tasted like ash in my mouth. It was the kind of expensive, bubbly poison that usually signifies celebration. But for me, it was just the bitter punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very expensive sentence. Across the polished mahogany table, bathed in the soft glow of the crystal chandelier in our newly acquired dining room, my husband Thomas looked like a titan. His suit was perfectly tailored, his smile practiced and wide for the photographers from Business Weekly who had just left, buzzing about the dynamic duo taking on the global market. 15 years I'd poured into him, from a nervous junior analyst whose suit smelled faintly of mothballs to the newly minted senior vice president of international acquisitions. I remembered the tiny, cramped apartment, the microwave meals, the nights I stayed up proofreading his quarterly reports, fueled by lukewarm coffee while he slept fitfully, dreaming of corner offices. I gave up my own promising career in urban planning, a career my father had lovingly funded, to become his anchor, his social camouflage, his perfect, silent wife. And tonight, that investment was supposed to culminate in a toast to us. But Thomas wasn't raising his glass to us. He was staring at me with a strange, disconcerting coolness, the kind of detached professionalism he usually reserved for hostile takeover targets. "Darling, a toast," he said, his voice booming slightly, practiced for the cameras. I raised my flute, my hand trembling just enough for the tiny bubbles to dance wildly against the glass. "To Thomas," I managed, forcing a smile that felt like cracked porcelain. "To the future." He took a long, slow sip, setting the glass down with deliberate precision. The room suddenly felt too large, the air too thin. His mother, Eleanor, Thomas's formidable, perfectly preserved matriarch, who always smelled of expensive French soap and judgment, leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Such a wonderful achievement, Thomas. You've finally surpassed your grandfather's expectations. You truly are the golden boy." She winked at me. "And Sarah, you've been instrumental, haven't you, dear? Supporting him through all those lean years." I nodded, my throat tight. "It was my pleasure, Eleanor." Then Thomas cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, cutting through the lingering applause in the room's atmosphere. He didn't look at his mother. His eyes were locked solely on mine, and the practiced corporate warmth had evaporated, replaced by something cold and final. "Actually, Eleanor, Sarah, I need to address something before we move on to dessert." He paused, and the silence was monumental. It was the kind of silence you only hear right before an explosion, or a verdict. "I've been thinking a lot about the next phase of my life. This promotion, it changes everything. It opens doors I hadn't realized were closed before." I blinked, waiting for the punchline. Maybe he was joking about taking a vacation finally. "And what doors are those, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to inject lightness into my voice. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his posture radiating unassailable authority. "The door to my bachelor life, Sarah. Effective immediately, I'd like us to begin the separation process. I'm filing for divorce." The crystal glass slipped from my fingers. It didn't shatter. It hit the thick Persian rug with a dull, sickening thud, the expensive champagne pooling like dark, sticky shame around my silk pumps. Eleanor gasped, a high theatrical sound, but Thomas just watched me, impassive, as if I were merely a failing subsidiary he was liquidating. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my chest, the noise of the city outside suddenly roaring in my ears. "What are you talking about, Thomas? We just bought this house. We signed the papers last week." "I took care of the paperwork for the house transfer this morning," he corrected smoothly. "It's solely in my name now. I've instructed my lawyers to send over the settlement proposal tomorrow. You'll have more than enough to live comfortably?" "Comfortably?" I whispered, the words scraping my throat raw. "You're throwing away 15 years for a title? For what? For some 20-something assistant who can actually keep up with your schedule?" Thomas actually smiled then, a flicker of genuine contempt crossing his face. "No, Sarah. Not for an assistant. For freedom. I never truly wanted a partner in my life. I needed an administrator, and frankly, you've become quite redundant now that I have a full executive support team. This isn't about a new fling. This is about streamlining my assets, and you, my dear, are an outdated liability." He stood up, towering over me. "I expect you to be out of the master suite by morning. I have an early flight to Tokyo, and I'd prefer not to have a scene before I leave." He gave a curt nod to his stunned mother, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out of the dining room, leaving me kneeling on the floor, surrounded by spilled champagne and the cold, hard reality of my erasure. I stayed there, heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I had misunderstood the entire conversation, until I heard the distinct sound of Thomas's BMW roaring down the drive, leaving me utterly alone in the cavernous, newly purchased tomb of our marriage. Then, the front door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the house, and I finally started to shake. But it wasn't just from shock. A terrifying, icy realization was beginning to dawn. Thomas hadn't just asked for a divorce. He just severed all ties with the woman who held the key to his entire, meticulously constructed empire, and I wasn't entirely sure he knew what I was capable of doing next. The morning after the execution, as Thomas so clinically termed the end of our marriage, felt surreal. The house was suffocatingly quiet. Eleanor, Thomas's mother, had done a commendable job of maintaining the facade of tragedy, flitting around me with hushed concern, all the while subtly photographing the designer boxes I was packing with her phone. She treated me like a contaminated object that needed immediate removal before the health inspector, Thomas, returned from his business trip. I was meticulous. Every box was labeled, taped, and stacked neatly by the service entrance. I wasn't running away. I was staging a tactical retreat. Thomas thought he'd won by controlling the assets, the house, the portfolio, the impressive social standing. He thought he had neutralized the liability. What he hadn't accounted for was the sheer, unadulterated depth of my commitment to his success, a commitment that involved secrets far heavier than antique silverware. When Thomas had first entered acquisitions, he was brilliant but volatile. He made enemies faster than he made deals. I hadn't just proofread his reports. I'd acted as his external memory, his moral compass, and occasionally his digital janitor. He had a habit of cutting corners when the pressure mounted, little adjustments in the data, aggressive email exchanges he later regretted, and documents that needed to disappear before compliance walked through the door. I had been the one to sanitize the mess, always ensuring that every thread led back to a legitimate, albeit strained business decision, never to outright fraud. I remembered one particularly terrifying incident 3 years ago, involving a shell corporation in the Caymans that Thomas had set up in a panic when a competitor started sniffing around an overseas merger. I'd spent 72 hours straight rerouting server traffic and generating false paper trails. Thomas had sworn on my father's grave he'd never take such risks again. I finished packing the last box, a small, unassuming one containing my old work laptop. the one I'd insisted on keeping even after Thomas bought me a newer model for Christmas last year. For old memories, I'd said. Now it held the true memories. Eleanor materialized in the hallway just as I was sealing the final box, her expression shifting from pity to thinly veiled triumph. "Sarah, dear, Thomas left a separate instruction regarding your personal vehicle," she announced, holding up a crisp white envelope embossed with Thomas's corporate seal. "He insisted you take the older sedan. He needs the Tesla for client transport immediately." I took the envelope, my fingers brushing hers. A brief, chilling contact. "Of course, Eleanor. How thoughtful of Thomas to think of the logistics." I didn't open the envelope. I didn't need to. I knew what it contained. A low limit on a temporary debit card, and perhaps a list of preferred moving companies Thomas had already vetted. I walked out to the garage. The Tesla, sleek and black, sat gleaming under the automatic when I still had ambitions beyond hosting cocktail Thomas believed he was stepping into. As I opened the Volvo's trunk, beside it sat my trusty, looking back slightly at the house. Dusty 2018 The silence was waiting Volvo. For me to fill it with noise, with anger, with a lawsuit. But lawsuits were slow, messy, and public. Thomas valued discretion and upward mobility above all else. He wouldn't expect a public fight. He'd expect a quiet exit, a dignified fade into the background of his triumphant narrative. I closed the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The Volvo roared to life with a familiar, reassuring rumble. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at the rearview mirror, catching Eleanor standing sentinel in the doorway, waving a dramatically sad farewell. I drove for 3 hours, not toward the small apartment my sister had offered, but toward a location Thomas would never think to check, the remote storage unit I'd rented years ago near the industrial docks, under my maiden name. Once there, I retrieved the one thing I couldn't risk taking directly from the house, a single heavily encrypted external hard drive. I plugged the drive into the old laptop in the dim, dusty unit. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single folder labeled simply Contingency. I opened the folder. Inside weren't resignation letters or sentimental photos. There were bank statements from anonymous accounts, detailed communication logs from encrypted messaging apps Thomas thought he'd purged, and a folder labeled Project Orion Unsanctioned Transfers. This was it. The leverage. The real collateral. Thomas hadn't just climbed the corporate ladder. He'd used a few questionable handholds on the way up. Handholds I had personally greased. I took a deep, steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of old cardboard and dust. It was time to call someone. Not a lawyer, not my sister, but someone who understood the true language of high finance and institutional warfare. I pulled up the contact list, scrolled past the familiar names, and stopped at a number saved only as the broker. I hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a gruff, weary voice answered. "Yeah?" "It's Sarah," I said, my voice steady, professional, entirely devoid of emotion. "Tell Mr. Vance that Project Orion is ready for extraction, and tell him Thomas just made a very costly mistake." There was a beat of silence on the other end, heavy with implications. Then the broker chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "Vance will be interested, Sarah. Very interested. But you need to know something. Thomas isn't the only one who hired private cleanup crews recently. We intercepted a burner phone ping near your apartment complex last night. It wasn't one of his lawyers. It was a security contractor known for persuasive discussions, the kind that leave people with permanent silence. They were looking for that laptop, Sarah, before you even left the house." The broker's words landed like ice water in my veins, instantly snapping the thin thread of my practiced calm. Security contractor, not lawyers. Thomas hadn't just filed for divorce, he'd authorized a wet work operation against his own wife before his flight even cleared the state line. He hadn't just called me redundant. He deemed me an active threat, requiring neutralization. "Who hired them?" I demanded, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, glancing wildly at the single grimy window of the storage unit, half expecting to see a lens focused on me. "Vance wasn't specific," the broker replied, his tone now serious, stripped of its earlier amusement. "But the team's known signature is usually tied to high-level executive risk management, the kind that cleans up messy internal affairs before the SEC even gets the memo. They were tracking movement around your residence, meaning Thomas or someone very close to him activated them immediately after you two finished dinner last night, before he even boarded the plane." My mind raced, replaying the night. The celebratory dinner, the champagne, Thomas walking out the door looking utterly composed. He hadn't just been leaving for Tokyo, he had been setting a trap. He'd waited until I was physically locked inside my role as the scorned, grieving wife, expecting me to retreat silently before sending in the wolves to retrieve any lingering evidence. "They missed," I stated, gripping the laptop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I'm operating under an alias at an undisclosed location. They won't find me here." "Maybe not you," the broker countered darkly. "But they know what you took. They know the general scope of what you kept locked down. Sarah, this isn't a divorce battle. This is a corporate assassination attempt, and you're holding the detonator. You need to move fast. They'll start interviewing everyone you've ever associated with professionally, your past employers, your old mentors, even your sister's husband's associates." My sister, Clara. Thomas's mother had already made polite small talk with Clara last week, ostensibly congratulating her on her promotion, but clearly probing for weaknesses. If they started applying pressure to Clara's family, they wouldn't stop until they found me. "What's the play?" I asked the broker, ignoring the gnawing panic. I needed action, not advice on where to hide. "Vance wants the Project Orion data. He sees it as potential ammunition against Thomas's controlling shareholders who he thinks are planning a coup. Vance is offering you a clean slate, immunity from any of Thomas's collateral damage, and a substantial payout if you deliver the drive before Thomas lands in Asia. If Thomas gets his hands on that data first, he buries it, buries you, and frames the whole mess as a disgruntled, unstable employee trying to extort him. And what if I don't trust Vance? Then you have two men with professional silencers hunting you by dawn. Thomas is desperate, Sarah. He doesn't just want to divorce you, he wants to erase the paper trail you represent." The weight of the decision settled on me. Trust the shadowy corporate fixer or trust the man who had just ordered my elimination. It wasn't really a choice. I quickly copied the crucial files onto a single high-security flash drive, the only piece of physical media I'd trust outside the storage unit. I disconnected the hard drive, tossing it back into the main box. "Tell Vance I'll meet him," I said. But I set the terms. No intermediaries, no prearranged locations. I meet him in neutral territory and I see his credentials first. Tell him I need absolute assurance that Clara and her family are untouchable from this moment forward. "Understood," the broker confirmed. "He's in the city tonight. He suggested the Metropolitan Museum of Art Gala tomorrow evening. Everyone who matters is there. It's heavily guarded, but Vance has his own security presence inside. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the laptop screen. Sarah, the perfect corporate wife, was gone. In her place was someone sharp, dangerous, and profoundly motivated by survival. I had nothing left to lose, which, ironically, made me the most dangerous player on the board. "The Met Gala," I repeated, a faint smile touching my lips, a public stage, a perfect place to expose a titan. "Tell Vance I'll be there. I'll arrive precisely at 8:30 p.m. and broker," I added, lowering my voice further. "Tell him I'm bringing my own defense." I hung up and pocketed the small flash drive. As I reached for the storage unit door handle, intending to lock up and disappear back into the anonymity of the city streets, the heavy metal door suddenly rattled violently from the outside. A harsh, metallic scraping sound echoed through the unit, followed by a low, authoritative voice amplified by a loudspeaker just outside the frame of the door. "Internal security sweep initiated. Do not attempt to exit the unit. We know you're in there, Ms. Hayes. We just want to retrieve the stolen property and escort you to a wellness retreat." My heart leaped. They hadn't been looking at the house. They had been tracking me. They must have traced my temporary debit card usage when I bought gas hours ago, or perhaps the broker hadn't been as secure as he claimed. I spun around, scanning the dusty confines of the unit, desperate for an escape route that didn't exist. The only exit was the door currently being breached. Suddenly, a heavy, specialized crowbar jammed into the door jamb, and the grinding sound intensified as the metal seal began to buckle under immense pressure. I had seconds before they tore it open, and I was armed only with an old laptop and a flash drive that could send Thomas to prison, or worse, to an early grave. I lunged toward the back corner of the unit where a stack of old, heavy furniture boxes stood, praying they were heavy enough to buy me a crucial few seconds, just as the lock mechanism gave way with a deafening crack and the storage unit door began to swing inward, revealing two enormous figures, clad entirely in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by ballistic masks, their hands already reaching for their holstered weapons. The blast of light from the hallway was blinding after the dim interior of the storage unit. The two tactical figures hesitated for only a split second, momentarily adjusting to the sudden illumination, but that fraction of time was all I needed. I didn't try to fight them. That would have been suicide. Instead, I threw the stack of heavy cardboard boxes, filled with old tax returns and broken pottery, directly at their midsections. The impact wasn't enough to knock them down, but it was enough to disrupt their formation. One of the men grunted, stumbling back a step, momentarily losing his balance against the doorframe. I didn't wait for the second man to recover. I scrambled low, tucking the flash drive deep into the waistband of my trousers, and dove under the heavy workbench bolted to the back wall. "Unit 412 secured. Target attempting evasion," the lead agent barked into his mic, his voice synthesized and emotionless through the mask. I could hear the rapid, heavy footfalls of the second agent as he navigated the debris I'd thrown, his weapon now clearly visible, a compact, intimidating rifle. He swept the room with a tight beam of light, catching the edge of the workbench just as I pressed myself flat against the concrete floor. "I see movement under the bench." Before he could zero in, I did the only thing left to do in a space this confined. I created chaos. I kicked out violently with both feet, not toward the agent, but toward the large, unstable stack of boxes I'd just disturbed. The entire tower wobbled, then collapsed with a surprisingly loud, dusty roar, burying the front of the unit in paper and shattered ceramic shards. The second agent shouted in surprise as a hail of debris rained down. He fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the small space, the bullet burying itself harmlessly into the drywall opposite my hiding spot. "Seal the exits! Lock down the perimeter! She's armed with proprietary data. Do not damage the hardware," the first agent yelled, now sounding more frustrated. I realized my window was closing fast. They were trained professionals. They wouldn't be fooled by a pile of junk for long. I crawled backward, finding the small access panel on the back wall of the storage unit, a maintenance hatch I'd spotted when first renting the space, meant for running utility lines, barely large enough for a small child. It was a desperate gamble. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the small multi-tool I kept hidden in my boot heel. The latch was stiff, coated in decades of industrial paint. The muffled sounds of the agents fighting through the debris suggested they were only moments away from reaching my hiding spot. I scraped, sawed, and pried at the corroded metal until, with a final screeching groan of protest, the latch gave way. I shoved the panel open just as the first agent rounded the fallen boxes. He spotted me, a sliver of movement near the back wall, and raised his weapon. "Stop right there!" I squeezed my shoulders together and threw myself into the black, narrow void behind the wall. It was pitch black, filled with cold, dusty air and the smell of stale insulation. I pulled the access panel shut behind me, praying the flimsy latch would hold for a few crucial seconds. I heard the agent slam against the exterior panel immediately, cursing loudly. "She's behind the wall! Breaching the back wall now!" I didn't have time to check if the hatch would hold. I started crawling forward into the tight, claustrophobic tunnel, moving blindly, relying only on the slight, downward slope I felt beneath my hands. The crawl space was narrow, pressing against my chest, making every breath feel shallow and earned. Behind me, I heard the sickening sound of metal tearing. They weren't bothering with the lock anymore. They were cutting through the reinforced steel backing of the unit. Just as the tearing sound reached a fever pitch, the tunnel abruptly opened into a wider, darker space. I tumbled out onto a cold, concrete floor, rolling instinctively to absorb the impact. I looked up, expecting to see the interior of another storage unit, but what greeted me made my blood run cold. I was in an enormous, echoing basement. Massive industrial pipes dripped slowly overhead, and the air smelled sharply of ozone and decaying machinery. Looking back, the hole I'd crawled through was just a small, jagged opening in a massive, unmarked steel wall. I wasn't in a public storage facility anymore. This felt like a bunker, or perhaps a private corporate sublevel. And then I saw the signs. Large institutional signs bolted to the ceiling beams, illuminated by occasional emergency strip lighting. They were marked with logos I instantly recognized from Thomas's most sensitive internal memos. Logos associated with Blackwood Solutions, a notoriously opaque security and intelligence firm that Thomas had always insisted his company merely contracted with, never owned. Suddenly, a heavy pneumatic door hissed open 50 yards away, casting a harsh, rectangular slice of light across the vast concrete floor. A figure stepped out, not in tactical gear, but in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. It was Thomas. He wasn't in Tokyo. He was standing there, calmly holding a phone, looking far too composed for a man whose wife had just escaped a containment team. He looked directly at me, standing there in the dusty shadows. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed smug. "Sarah," his voice echoed in the cavernous space, amplified by the acoustics of the bunker. He didn't shout. He merely spoke, and it carried. I knew you'd run to the only person you trusted who could actually keep up. You should know, darling, that the broker works for me now. He always has. I told him to set the meeting at the Met Gala because I wanted to see how far you'd run before you realized you've been delivering the evidence straight to my holding company all along." He paused, looking utterly victorious. "Now, hand over the drive, or I'll have Vance's people bring you out piece by piece." The silence that followed Thomas's pronouncement was more terrifying than the sound of the tactical team cutting through the steel. He knew. He didn't just suspect, he had engineered my entire escape route, funneling me directly into his waiting trap, using the broker as the final, most effective lure. The relief that had flooded me upon escaping the storage unit evaporated, replaced by a chilling clarity. I wasn't just betrayed by my husband, I was cornered by a highly organized, multi-layered conspiracy. I stared at Thomas, who stood perfectly still, radiating the effortless authority he'd earned through years of ruthless maneuvering I had unwittingly enabled. Behind him, the heavy pneumatic door remained open, bathing the far end of the basement in white light, but I knew the tactical team wouldn't rush in yet. Thomas wanted the satisfaction of taking the drive himself, confirming his total dominance before the final severance. My hand instinctively went to the flash drive taped beneath my waistband. If I handed it over now, I was signing my own death warrant. If I resisted, I was facing men who were clearly authorized to use lethal force. But Thomas had made one crucial miscalculation in his hubris. He believed I was running to the broker for help. He didn't understand that I was running past the broker, using him as a necessary, albeit compromised, intermediary to reach the true destination. "You're right, Thomas," I said, my voice startlingly steady despite the adrenaline thrumming through my system. I let a small, genuine smile surface, a cold, razor-sharp expression that mirrored the expression he'd worn on our wedding day when he closed his first major deal. "You planned this impeccably, from the divorce filing to the burner phones. You even anticipated my need for a clean slate payout." I slowly pulled the flash drive free, holding it up between my thumb and forefinger so the dim emergency lights caught the polished metal. "But you forgot one thing about administrators, Thomas. We don't just clean up messes, we create redundancies." Thomas frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face for the first time. "What are you talking about?" "Project Orion," I continued, taking a single measured step out of the shadows toward the center of the vast floor, putting myself halfway between the breach point and Thomas. "You thought the drive in my possession was the only copy? That was the decoy. The data you think you're about to confiscate, it's mostly just a collection of dummy financial statements I designed to look damning if you panicked and tried to use it without context." His composure shattered. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "Liar! You wouldn't dare risk destroying everything." "Oh, I wouldn't destroy it, Thomas. That would be messy, and I'm surprisingly fond of keeping my hands clean these days." I gestured toward the massive steel wall behind me, the wall separating this private bunker from the public storage facility. The real data, the complete verified transfer logs, the direct communications proving your personally directed insider trading to manipulate the Archer merger, that's not on this drive. That's already where it needs to be. I paused, letting the implication sink in. He hadn't been tracking my movements. He had been tracking the location of the decoy drive. Remember when I said I needed absolute assurance regarding Clara's family? I didn't call the broker to arrange a meeting with Vance. I called him to initiate the failsafe. Thomas let out a strangled sound, realizing the depth of the trap. "No, you wouldn't contact Vance directly without my authorization." "Authorization is irrelevant when you've been declared a high-risk liability by your own protection detail," I interrupted, enjoying the raw panic in his eyes. "Vance doesn't care about me, Thomas. He cares about institutional stability. He knows that if you are about to be taken down for massive fraud, his investment in Blackwood Solutions becomes worthless. So I didn't give Vance the data to us expose you. I gave him a data packet that, when accessed, automatically triggered an anonymous regulatory filing, a pre-scheduled time-locked notification directly to the SEC's most aggressive enforcement division. I held up the decoy drive again, tossing it dismissively into the air and catching it one-handed. This drive was the activation key. By having your security team breach the storage unit, you confirmed the timeline. The moment they started cutting that lock, Thomas, the automated trigger fired. It's already sent. The SEC is currently opening sealed envelopes across 3 continents, all pointing directly back to your personal accounts. Thomas lunged forward, abandoning all pretense of calm authority. "You manipulative bitch!" He crossed the distance between us in 3 powerful strides. I didn't run this time. I waited until his massive shadow enveloped me, his hand outstretched to grab the drive. As his fingers brushed mine, I performed the final devastating move. I didn't drop the drive. I slammed it hard against the concrete floor, shattering the casing. The tiny memory chip fragmented into useless dust. "Too late," I whispered right in his face. "The evidence is already out of your reach." Just as Thomas roared in pure, unadulterated fury, a new sound drowned out everything else. Not the controlled sirens of local police, but the deep, heavy thrum of military-grade rotor blades descending rapidly overhead. Floodlights suddenly pierced the gloom of the basement entrance, not the white light of Blackwood security, but the unmistakable amber and blue wash of federal agencies. Through the doorway, a line of figures in crisp official FBI tactical vests appeared, weapons raised, their shouts authoritative and immediate. "Federal investigation, drop your weapons and assume the position. Anyone resisting will be apprehended." Thomas froze, his posture collapsing as he realized the magnitude of the collapse. He wasn't just facing divorce, he was facing institutional ruin, orchestrated entirely by the quiet woman he deemed redundant. I stood perfectly still between him and the approaching agents, the broken plastic shell of the decoy drive still clutched in my hand. The tactical team from Blackwood, seeing the federal presence, wisely backed away, melting back into the shadows of the bunker, knowing they were now hopelessly compromised. As the lead FBI agent approached, his eyes sweeping over the scene, the defeated Titan, the shattered drive, and me standing silently in the center, he looked at Thomas, then back at me, a clear question in his eyes. "Ms. Hayes?" he asked formally. I nodded once, finally allowing the relief to wash over me, knowing Clara was safe, knowing the game was over. "Yes, I have a full statement prepared, but first I'd like to formally request protection. And," I added, glancing at the disgraced Thomas, who was already being roughly cuffed, "I need to speak to Mr. Vance about my severance package. It seems I've earned a very significant bonus for involuntary asset liquidation.